At this year's Labour Party conference, Prime Minister Sir Keir Starmer sat down for an interview that touched on one of the most pressing questions facing Britain today: living standards. Speaking candidly, he said the following.
So we're laser focused on making sure that we reduce cost and we work with businesses to make sure that they can thrive.
But people are not feeling better off.
Well,
when will they feel better off?
Wages have gone up in the last 10 months more than they went up in the last 10 years.
But the cost of food is going up more.
Just hear me out. Childcare, we've rolled out free childcare from 9 months to 4 years. That's thousands of pounds saved for families who would otherwise have had to pay for childcare. We've introduced provisions for free school meals. So there are measures we've taken. I'm not going to sit here and pretend that's all that's necessary. We need to do more, much more, to make sure that people feel better off. And I know that at the next election, I will be judged, rightly judged, by people on the basis, have living standards gone up? Do I feel better? Do I feel better off? Secondly, are public services better? Is the health service genuinely better than when we took over at the election last July? And do I feel more safe and secure in my own community? I'm determined to meet each of those tests.
Starmer made it clear that his government will be judged on 3 key tests ahead of the next election. 1, do people feel better off? 2, are public services, especially the NHS, improving? And 3, do people feel more safe and secure in their communities? In this video, we're focusing on the first: do people feel better off? And to answer that, we'll explore both the data on salaries and the broader picture of living standards in Britain today. While the Prime Minister speaks with optimism about progress, the Independent's evidence flatly contradicts that view, showing that for many households, living standards are not improving at all. The Resolution Foundation's latest Living Standards Outlook 2025 paints a much darker picture. The report warns that without major policy changes, Britain is on track for a decade of stagnation or worse. In fact, the Foundation describes this period as a living standards bust, boom and bleak outlook that could leave the 2020s as the first decade of the modern era to witness no improvement in disposable incomes across Britain. To put that into perspective, even during previous decades marked by recessions, Britain still saw household incomes rise in real terms. But now, for the first time in modern history, the average family could reach the end of the decade no better off than when it began. Before diving deeper into the analysis, let's look at the numbers that affect how millions of people actually experience day-to-day life: their salaries. Let's break down the numbers. Here's the graph showing average earnings by age. How do you compare to others in your age group? According to Starling Bank, people aged 18 to 21 earn an average of just over £22,000 a year. Move into your late 20s and that figure climbs to around £34,700. By your 30s, average earnings rise to about £45,000 and they peak in your 40s at roughly £51,000 a year. After that, salaries start to level off, with those in their 50s earning around £50,000 and people over 60 averaging about £46,000. But here's where it gets interesting. The top 10% of earners in each age group make 50 to 70% more than the average person. For example, a worker in their 30s earning at the top 10% level could be taking home over £70,000 a year, while someone the same age earning an average salary makes around £45,000. This shows how steep the pay gap is, even among people of the same age, and why simply saying wages are up doesn't tell the full story. Understanding the shape of the salary curve helps explain why so many people don't feel better off. The top earners may be doing fine, but the vast majority, especially those under 30 or working in regions outside London and the South East, are still struggling to keep up with inflation, rising rents and interest rate pressures. And there's another crucial factor: tax thresholds. Wages are rising, yes, but the government's income tax threshold freeze is still in place. More and more people are being quietly pulled into higher tax brackets. There are also strong rumours that this freeze could be extended in the upcoming 26th of November budget. Take, for instance, this article from The Guardian. Rachel Reeves is expected to extend a freeze on income tax thresholds to raise fresh funds after the government's U-turn on welfare cuts left her with a growing budget hole. Economists often refer to these tax threshold freezes as a stealth tax because as inflation and wages rise, frozen thresholds mean you pay more tax even though your real spending power doesn't actually improve. This process is known as fiscal drag. It doesn't raise the official tax rate, but it increases the tax burden on ordinary workers. In a fair system, those tax thresholds would normally rise with inflation or with average wage growth, keeping take-home pay roughly in line with living costs. But because they're frozen, every pay rise risks pushing more of your income into a higher bracket. So even though your salary might look bigger on paper, you could actually end up paying more tax and affording less. It's a subtle squeeze, but one that's having a real impact on living standards. As essentials like food, rent, and energy remain high, more households are losing a larger share of their income to tax. The result? Many people feel poorer, even while technically earning more. Now let's turn to the independent analysis. The Resolution Foundation's Living Standards Outlook 2025 offers a sobering counterpoint to the Prime Minister's confidence. The report opens with a stark line here. The outlook for living standards across Britain is bleak, with typical incomes on track to grow by just 1% over the second half of the decade. That's not 1% per year, that's 1% total, spread across 5 years. In real terms, that means almost no improvement on how much households have left over after paying their bills. And when you factor in the rate of inflation, it looks even worse. Food price inflation rose for the 5th month in a row in August, with costs rising at the fastest pace since the beginning of last year. The cost of food and non-alcoholic drinks grew at an annual rate of 5.1% as beef, butter, milk and chocolate prices continued to surge. So even though wages may rise slightly, the everyday essentials people depend on are rising much faster. The result is a squeeze that quietly erodes disposable income. That means the 1% growth projected by the Resolution Foundation isn't really growth at all. It's effectively a decline once the rising costs of living are taken into account. For lower income families, the situation is even worse. The Foundation warns lower income families are on course to fare even worse, with incomes projected to fall by 1% over the second half of the decade. Meanwhile, the incomes of the richest half of the population are on track to rise by 1%. In other words, the gap between the rich and poor is widening, not narrowing. The report continues, highlighting how housing costs play a defining role in who feels better off and who doesn't. It states, mortgages are on track to see their incomes fall by 1% on average, as high interest rates continue to bear down on households coming off the fixed rate deals. Those fortunate enough to own their homes outright, however, are projected to see incomes rise by 3%, a reminder of how uneven the economic playing field has become. Perhaps most eye-opening sentence in the entire report is this one. The living standards bust, boom and bleak outlook could lead the 2020s as the first decade of the modern era to witness low improvement in disposable incomes across Britain. That statement cannot be overstated. It means that for the first time in modern history, a generation could reach the end of a decade without any real financial progress. For decades, there's been an unspoken promise in Britain that each generation will be better off than the last. Steady, decade-on-decade income growth has been part of the social contract, something people could count on. But that promise is now under threat. In the 2000s, disposable income rose by 18%. In the 2010s, even through austerity and a financial crisis, they still grew by 9%. But the 2020s are projected to deliver zero growth, a complete halt to progress. After adjusting for inflation, that means the average household in 2029 may be no better off or even worse than in 2019. For millions, it would mark the first decade in modern British history where living standards didn't rise at all. This is more than just a statistic. It's a warning that the long-standing norm of gradual prosperity may be breaking down. Economists are calling it a potential lost decade for living standards. The economic pie isn't growing, and for ordinary household, that means the future could feel smaller, tighter, and less hopeful than the past. And this may help explain something bigger happening right now in British politics. For most of modern history, the UK's political system has been dominated by two parties, Labour and the Conservatives, each trading power but sharing the same basic promise, that under their leadership, the country would move forward and living standards would rise. But today, that promise feels broken. The 2020s are shaping up to be the first decade in modern British history where households are no better off than they were 10 years earlier. And when people feel that that system no longer delivers progress, they begin looking for alternatives. We're now seeing the dismantling of the two-party. 5 parties, Labour, the Conservatives, Reform UK, the Liberal Democrats and the Greens are all polling in double digits. That's unprecedented in modern times. As principal economist Adam Corlett put it, the living standards story of the decade so far has been bust and boom, with COVID-19 and a cost of living crisis, followed by a much needed recovery last year. But the rest of the decade looks bleak, with typical household incomes set to grow by just 1% over the next 5 years. This paints a starkly different picture from the government narrative. The Prime Minister says wages have gone up, but what matters more is real disposable income, the money left after taxes, housing and inflation, and according to the data, that figure is barely moving. It's easy to see why many households aren't feeling the optimism voiced by politicians. The UK's economy is producing winners and losers, and the difference between the two often comes down to age, housing, status and region. Younger workers are earning less than previous generations did at their age when adjusted for inflation. Renters and mortgage holders face constant financial strain, while pensioners, buoyed by the triple lock, are actually seeing their incomes rise faster than the working population. The Resolution Foundation found that pensioners are set to fare best of all, with their incomes forecast to rise by 5%. The contrast between political optimism and economic reality could not be sharper. The Prime Minister speaks of progress and opportunity, but the data from independent analysts suggests Britain is entering a period of prolonged financial stagnation. This wage data shows that while salaries have risen in nominal terms, the average worker's purchasing power has been eroded by inflation and high living costs. Real progress isn't measured by the size of your paycheck alone, it's measured by what that paycheck can buy. The Resolution Foundation's conclusion is clear. Unless Britain sees major structural reforms, the 2020s could be remembered as a lost decade for living standards. And that's a seismic statement. It means that even after economic shocks like the 2008 crisis and the pandemic, Britain has never faced a decade with near zero real income growth until now. Before we wrap up, let's take one final look. This chart tells another side of the story. The average salary in London stands at about £65,994, with the top 10% earning well over £105,000. But move just a few hundred miles north and the picture changes dramatically. In regions like Yorkshire and the Humber, Northern Ireland or the East Midlands, the average salary drops to around £39,000. Even in areas like the North West and West Midlands, it barely crosses £41,000. That's a difference of more than £25,000 between London and much of the rest of the country. A gap that's not just about numbers, but about opportunity, cost of living and quality of life. These regional divides have always existed, but in recent years they've deepened. The pandemic, rising housing costs and the uneven spread of high-paying industries have widened the economic map of Britain. While London and parts of the South East continue to pull ahead, large sections of the UK, particularly the North, the Midlands and parts of Wales, are struggling to keep pace. And when you add everything we've talked about, the income tax threshold freeze, the steep cost of food and rent, and inflation running above 5%, those regional disparities become even more significant. In the southeast, a family might be able to absorb those rising costs, but in the north, where wages are lower and local economies are more fragile, even small changes in inflation or tax policy can push households from stability to struggle. So, after everything we've looked at today, the data, the forecasts, and the political promises, were you surprised by these numbers? Do you feel better off than you did a few years ago? Or do you think something deeper is happening? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and we'll see you in the next one.